My name is Belinda, and at 28, I stood at my law school graduation ceremony scanning the rows of empty seats where my parents should have been. My phone buzzed with a notification that changed everything. There was my sister Cassandra, posting photos from Hawaii with our parents, champagne glasses raised in paradise while I prepared to walk across the stage alone. 7 years of sacrifice, and they chose a vacation over their promise to be there. What they didn't know was that I was about to sign papers that would cost them everything. Before I continue this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who understands the pain of being overlooked by family? Please hit that like button if you've ever felt invisible to the people who should love you most. And don't forget to subscribe because what happens next will show you that sometimes the best revenge isn't what you'd expect. Trust me, you'll want to hear how a dying grandmother's secret and a stranger's kindness at graduation led to the ultimate payback. Growing up as the older daughter should have meant something, but in my family, it only meant watching my younger sister Cassandra get everything while I got the leftovers. I remember being 12 years old, standing on the stage as valedictorian of my middle school, searching the audience for my parents' faces. They weren't there. Cassandra had a dance recital across town, and apparently, watching her stumble through a routine she'd barely practiced was more important than hearing my speech about perseverance. That was just the beginning of a pattern that would define my entire life. My mother would always say I was the responsible one, the one who didn't need attention or supervision. What she really meant was that I was convenient to ignore. When I got accepted to my dream college with a partial scholarship, my celebration dinner turned into a discussion about Cassandra's failing grades and how much tutoring would cost. I sat there with my acceptance letter in my lap while they strategized about hiring the best tutors money could buy for my sister, who couldn't be bothered to show up to class half the time. The real betrayal came during my sophomore year of college. I'd been counting on the college fund my parents had promised me since childhood. The one they'd sworn was sitting in an account with my name on it. When I went to access it for my junior year tuition, the account was empty. Every last penny had been drained. My father couldn't even look me in the eye when he explained that Cassandra had this amazing business opportunity, a boutique that would surely make millions. They'd invested my entire college fund into her dream, leaving me with nothing but broken promises and student loan applications. I worked 3 jobs to stay in school. Early mornings at a coffee shop, afternoons tutoring, and weekends at a bookstore. My grades never slipped because I couldn't afford for them to. Meanwhile, Cassandra's boutique failed within 6 months, and she consoled herself with a year-long trip to Europe funded by our parents' credit cards. They called it a learning experience. I called it from my dorm room between shifts, exhausted and bitter. Through all of this, there was one person who saw me for who I really was. Grandma Rose, my mother's mother, lived in an upscale retirement community 40 minutes from campus. While my parents made excuses for why they couldn't visit me, Grandma Rose came to every small achievement. She sat in the front row when I was inducted into the Honor Society. She brought homemade cookies when I was sick during finals week. She was the one who told me I was worth more than being second best in my own family. One afternoon during my senior year, Grandma Rose asked me to visit her alone. She made her famous lemon tea and sat me down with a serious expression I'd never seen before. She told me about her late husband, my grandfather who died before I was born. He'd been an inventor, held several patents that still generated income. The assisted living facility she lived in wasn't paid for by my parents as they claimed, but by her own wealth. She'd been careful to keep the extent of it hidden, watching how my parents behaved with money, especially when it came to funding Cassandra's every whim. That day, she held my hand and made me a promise. She said she was leaving me something special in her will, but I had to keep it absolutely quiet. She'd seen how my parents manipulated and guilt-tripped me whenever I showed any sign of independence or success. They'd already been asking her for loans they never intended to repay, always for Cassandra's latest venture or emergency. Grandma Rose saw through it all, and she wanted to make sure that when the time came, I'd be protected. The manipulation from my parents was subtle but constant. Whenever I achieved something on my own, they'd find a way to minimize it. When I got into law school, my mother's first response was to remind me that Cassandra was sensitive about academic achievements and I shouldn't brag. When I made law review, my father asked if I could tutor Cassandra for her community college entrance exams instead of celebrating. They had a way of making me feel selfish for wanting recognition, guilty for succeeding where Cassandra failed. I spent 7 years in law school, working full-time while studying. Part-time programs take longer, but I couldn't afford to stop working. Every semester was a battle against exhaustion and financial stress. My parents never offered help, claiming they were tapped out from Cassandra's needs. She'd moved back home after Europe, then needed help with another failed business, then therapy for her anxiety about working regular jobs. There was always something, and it always came first. The resentment built slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a river. But I held on to hope that maybe, just maybe, when I finally reached this massive milestone of completing law school, they'd show up for me. Just once, I needed them to choose me. Graduation would be my moment, the culmination of years of sacrifice and determination. They'd promised to be there, sworn they wouldn't miss it for the world. I believed them because I needed to believe that somewhere deep down, they cared about my accomplishments too. I should have known better. The pattern was already set, and I was about to learn that some people never change, no matter how much you hope they will. 3 months before my law school graduation, I started planning everything with the excitement of a child preparing for Christmas. This wasn't just any graduation. It was the end of a 7-year journey that had nearly broken me multiple times. I called my parents with pure joy in my voice, telling them the date, the time, the venue. My mother actually sounded excited, promising they'd mark their calendars immediately. My father said he was proud of me, words I'd waited so long to hear that I actually started crying after I hung up the phone. For once, it seemed like they understood how much this meant to me. I sent them formal invitations in the mail, beautiful cards with gold embossing that cost more than I should have spent. Inside, I wrote personal notes about how much their presence would mean to me. I even included a schedule of the weekend's events, hoping we could have dinner together afterward at a nice restaurant I'd been researching. My mother texted me a photo of the invitation on their refrigerator, held up by a magnet that said "World's Best Parents." The irony wasn't lost on me, but I chose to see it as a good sign. 2 months before graduation, Cassandra called with breathless excitement about a sudden opportunity. One of her friends was getting married in Hawaii, destination wedding, and she'd been invited as a bridesmaid. The wedding was the same week as my graduation. My stomach dropped as she gushed about beaches and sunset ceremonies, but I held on to the fact that she hadn't mentioned our parents. Surely they'd remember their promise to me. The confrontation came 3 weeks later. My parents called me on speakerphone, their voices carefully neutral as they explained the situation. Cassandra's friend had offered to pay for a family vacation if they all came to the wedding. A full week in Hawaii, all expenses paid. My mother said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I reminded them about my graduation, the promise they'd made, the invitations on their refrigerator. The silence on the other end told me everything before they even started making excuses. My father cleared his throat and delivered the killing blow. He said Cassandra really needed this trip, that she'd been depressed lately, and this could really lift her spirits. Besides, he added, I was so independent and strong. Surely I'd understand that family sometimes meant making sacrifices. The word sacrifice nearly made me laugh out loud. What did they know about sacrifice? I bit my tongue until it bled, trying not to scream about the 3 jobs, the sleepless nights, the loans I'd be repaying for the next 20 years. The real knife twisted when I discovered the truth about the trip's financing. 2 months earlier, I'd lent my parents $5,000 for what they called a medical emergency. My mother had called me crying about unexpected bills, and despite my better judgment, I'd given them most of my savings. Now I learned through Cassandra's careless admission that they'd used that money as spending cash for the Hawaii trip. My emergency fund had become their vacation budget. I tried one last time to make them understand. I drove to their house on a Sunday afternoon, prepared to lay out exactly why this graduation meant everything to me. I found them in the living room, laptops open, browsing resort activities. My mother barely looked up when I walked in. I poured out my heart, told them about the nights I'd cried from exhaustion, the meals I'd skipped to afford textbooks, the friends I'd lost because I never had time to socialize. I explained that this ceremony wasn't just about a degree. It was about proving that all those sacrifices had been worth something. My mother's response broke something inside me that I don't think will ever fully heal. She said I was being dramatic and selfish, that I was too independent to really need them there anyway. She actually used the words too independent, as if my forced self-reliance was a character flaw, rather than a survival mechanism. She said Cassandra might never get married, and this could be their only chance for a family vacation. The fact that I wasn't invited to this family vacation apparently didn't strike her as ironic. My father's betrayal was quieter, but deeper. He took me aside and explained in his reasonable voice that they'd already put deposits down, that Cassandra would be heartbroken if they changed plans now. He said I should be proud of standing on my own 2 feet, that plenty of people graduate without family present. Then he delivered the final insult by suggesting that maybe this was better, that I wouldn't have to worry about them embarrassing me in front of my lawyer friends. As if I'd ever been embarrassed by them. All I'd ever wanted was for them to show up. I left their house that day knowing something fundamental had shifted. The hope I'd carried for so long finally died. My best friend Maya found me sitting in my car in her driveway, sobbing so hard I couldn't speak. She held me while I ugly cried about invitation cards and broken promises. When I finally calmed down enough to explain, she got quiet in that dangerous way that meant she was furious. Then she said something that changed everything. She said her family would come to my graduation. Her parents, her brothers, everyone. They'd be my family for the day. That same evening, my phone rang with a call from Grandma Rose's nursing home. She'd had a fall and was asking for me specifically. When I arrived, she was propped up in bed, looking frielier than I'd ever seen her but with eyes still sharp as a hawk. She already knew about Hawaii. She had her ways of keeping tabs on the family, and nothing surprised her anymore. She held my hand and told me she was dying, that the doctors gave her maybe a month. Then she said she had something important to tell me, something that would change everything if I was strong enough to see it through. Looking back, I think she knew she wouldn't make it to my graduation. She wanted to give me one last gift, one last piece of wisdom before she left me to face the world truly alone. The nursing facility where Grandma Rose lived was nothing like the typical places you imagine for the elderly. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and fresh flowers adorned every surface. I'd always wondered how my parents afforded it on their middle-class incomes, but as I sat beside her bed that evening, I was about to learn the truth about many things I'd never questioned. Grandma Rose had asked the nurse to give us complete privacy, and the way she kept glancing at the door told me this conversation would be different from any we'd had before. She started by talking about my grandfather, the man I'd never met but whose portrait hung in her room. He'd been an inventor, she said, a brilliant mind who held over 30 patents for medical devices. When he died young from a heart attack, he left behind a fortune that she'd carefully managed for 40 years. The assisted living facility, the comfortable lifestyle, none of it came from my parents. She'd been paying her own way all along, letting them believe they were supporting her while actually watching how they handled their perceived power over her. From a drawer in her nightstand, she pulled out 2 envelopes, both marked with legal seals. The first will, she explained, was the one everyone knew about. In it, she left modest sums to each family member, enough to seem fair but not enough to cause fighting. $100,000 each to my parents, Cassandra, and me. She'd shown this will to my parents during one of their visits. Watched their eyes light up with greed even as they pretended the money didn't matter. They'd already spent it in their minds, she told me with a bitter smile. The second envelope contained a document that made my hands shake. It was another will legally binding and properly witnessed, that told a completely different story. In this version, virtually everything went to me, with a few charitable donations and a small fund for her caregivers. We were talking about $2.5 million in liquid assets, plus investment properties worth even more. But there was a catch, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. This will would only be executed if I could provide evidence of abandonment by my immediate family. Graduation, she said, would be the perfect test. She introduced me to Mr. Chun, her lawyer who'd been posing as just another visitor whenever my parents were around. He'd been documenting everything for years at Grandma Rose's request. The money my parents claimed to contribute to her care, that actually went straight to Cassandra's ventures. The visits they canceled to take Cassandra on trips. The lies they told about me being too busy to visit when actually they'd discouraged me from coming. He had records, receipts, even recorded phone calls that painted a picture of systematic favoritism and financial exploitation. The depth of deception stunned me. My parents had been taking money from Grandma Rose for years, always with sob stories about Cassandra's needs. Medical bills that didn't exist, business investments that were shopping sprees, emergencies that were vacations. They'd taken almost $300,000 over the past decade, always swearing it was the last time. Grandma Rose had given it freely, not because she believed them but because she was building a case. Every withdrawal, every lie, every manipulation had been carefully documented. Then came the revelation that broke my heart all over again. Grandma Rose had been trying to attend my achievements all these years, but my parents had actively prevented it. They told her I was too busy for visitors during my college honors ceremony. They'd given her the wrong date for my law school acceptance celebration, when she'd wanted to help me financially. They'd convinced her I was too proud to accept money, all while funneling her funds to Cassandra. The assisted living staff confirmed it all. They'd watched my parents redirect her attempts to support me for years. Grandma Rose revealed that Cassandra had recently been pushing for power of attorney, claiming Grandma was becoming senile and needed help managing her affairs. The plan was to move her to a state facility and liquidate her assets, supposedly for her care but really to fund whatever scheme Cassandra had cooking. My parents were fully on board, already discussing how to divide the money. They had no idea about the second will, no clue that Grandma had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time. That night, Grandma Rose did something that would prove crucial later. She signed papers making me her healthcare proxy and giving me power of attorney, effective immediately. Mr. Chun had everything ready, including witnesses from the nursing staff who'd seen enough to know exactly what kind of family we were. She also gave me access to a safety deposit box containing evidence of every financial transaction, every broken promise, every lie my parents had told. The test she'd devised was elegant in its simplicity. If my parents attended my graduation, it would prove they could prioritize me when it mattered. The second will would remain a secret, and the first will would stand. But if they chose Cassandra and Hawaii over my biggest achievement, it would be the final proof of a pattern of abandonment that stretched back decades. She wasn't trying to buy my family's love for me. She was giving me permission to stop trying to earn it myself. As I sat processing this information, Grandma Rose told me about watching me grow up in the shadow of my sister's demands. She'd seen my light dim with each disappointment, watched me accept less and less while giving more and more. She said the money wasn't really about revenge, though she admitted that part would be satisfying. It was about freedom. Freedom from feeling obligated to people who'd never felt obligated to me. Freedom to build a life surrounded by people who actually showed up. Freedom to stop begging for scraps of attention from people who had plenty to give, but chose not to share. She made me promise not to feel guilty when the time came. My parents had made their choices freely, repeatedly, consistently. They'd had hundreds of chances to be different, to be better, to see me as more than an afterthought. She reminded me that I'd never asked for special treatment, just equal treatment. I'd never wanted to be the favorite, just to be seen. If they couldn't give me that after 28 years, they never would. Before I left that night, Grandma Rose gave me one last piece of advice. She told me to pay attention at graduation to who actually showed up. Real family, she said, isn't about blood or obligation or guilt. It's about choice. People choose to be there for you or they don't. And when someone shows you through their choices exactly where you rank in their priorities, you should believe them. Then you should act accordingly, without apology or explanation. I drove home that night with my entire worldview shifting. The graduation that had meant everything to me suddenly meant even more, but for different reasons. It was no longer about hoping my parents would finally see me. It was about finally seeing them, clearly and without the rose-colored glasses I'd worn my entire life. Grandma Rose had given me more than money. She'd given me permission to stop pretending our family was something it wasn't. She'd given me the freedom to choose my own family, just as they'd chosen theirs. Graduation morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that felt like mockery. Clear blue skies, gentle breeze, the sort of day that should have been filled with joy and celebration. I woke up at 5 in the morning, not from excitement but from the anxiety that had been building for weeks. Despite everything Grandma Rose had told me, despite knowing what was coming, some small part of me still hoped. Maybe they'd surprise me. Maybe they'd chosen me just this once. I checked my phone, hoping for a message saying they'd canceled the Hawaii trip. Instead, I found Cassandra's Instagram story showing their airport departure gate with the caption "Family Adventure Begins." I sat on the edge of my bed in my small apartment, holding my cap and gown like a life preserver. 7 years of work had led to this moment, and the 3 people who should have been celebrating with me were boarding a plane to paradise. My hands shook as I put on my makeup, trying not to cry and ruin the mascara. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, something professional but special, imagining my mother would want photos. Now it felt like wearing a costume for a play where I was the only actor who'd shown up. Maya arrived at 7 with coffee and her entire family in tow. Her parents, the Johnsons, had insisted on driving me to the ceremony. Mrs. Johnson took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug that nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. She didn't say anything about my missing family, just straightened my cap and told me I looked beautiful. Mr. Johnson carried my extra gown for photos later, treating it with the kind of care that made my chest tight. Maya's 2 brothers argued about who got to sit next to me at the ceremony, eventually deciding they'd flank me on both sides like bodyguards. The law school auditorium was packed with families. Everywhere I looked, I saw parents crying with pride, siblings taking photos, grandparents struggling with smartphones to capture the moment. I found my assigned seat among my classmates, many of whom I'd studied with through countless late nights. They excitedly pointed out their families in the crowd, and I smiled and nodded, mentioning the Johnsons were here for me. Nobody questioned it. Maya's family had that quality of belonging anywhere they went, and they'd claimed me so naturally that it almost felt true. 15 minutes before the ceremony began, my phone buzzed with messages. My mother had sent a text saying they'd made it to Hawaii safely, and wishing me good luck. The casualness of it, as if this was just another day, hit me like a physical blow. My father added a note about being proud of me, followed immediately by a request to wire money to Cassandra's account for some emergency expense that had come up on the trip. Even on my graduation day, I was just an ATM to them. Then came the group family text that shattered any remaining delusions I had about their capacity for empathy. Cassandra had created a group chat titled Family Paradise, and included everyone except me initially, then added me as an afterthought. The messages were full of beach photos, my Thai toasts, and plans for parasailing. My mother posted a photo of the 3 of them with the caption "Living our best lives" with a heart emoji. Someone, probably my father after a few drinks, had written "Glad we didn't miss this for some boring ceremony." The cruelty was so casual, so thoughtless, that it took my breath away. They weren't even trying to hide their priorities anymore. The ceremony began, and I forced myself to focus on the speakers talking about perseverance and achievement. When they called my name for the law review honors, the Johnsons erupted in cheers that could be heard over everyone else. Mrs. Johnson was crying and taking photos like I was her own daughter. Mr. Johnson stood up and clapped, shouting "That's our girl" in a voice thick with emotion. It wasn't until that moment that Maya leaned over and whispered something that reframed everything. She told me her older sister would have graduated law school this year too. Would have if cancer hadn't taken her 3 years ago. The Johnsons had planned to attend a graduation ceremony this spring, had dreamed of watching their daughter walk across the stage. Instead, they were here for me, pouring all that love and pride into a girl who wasn't even related to them, but who needed family more than anything in that moment. Mr. Johnson caught my eye and nodded, and I understood. We were filling empty spaces in each other's lives, choosing connection over absence. When I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, the Johnsons' cheers followed me, but in the silence between their voices, I heard the absence of my own parents' pride. The dean shook my hand and said congratulations, and I smiled for the official photographer, knowing these pictures would never hang on my parents' wall. As I returned to my seat, my phone lit up with more messages from the family chat. They were debating dinner reservations, completely oblivious to the fact that I was living one of the most important moments of my life without them. The final blow came as we filed out of the auditorium. Cassandra had posted a family photo on Instagram with a caption that made my stomach turn. Perfect family vacation. So blessed to have parents who prioritize what really matters. The comments were already filling up with friends saying how lucky she was, how beautiful they all looked, how nice it must be to have such devoted parents. One commenter asked if I was there too, and Cassandra responded that I was too busy with school stuff to join them. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized this was how our family story would be told forever if I let it. Mr. Chun, Grandma Rose's lawyer, appeared at my elbow as I stood frozen in the courtyard. He'd attended the ceremony to witness this moment for the legal records. He didn't say much, just quietly confirmed he'd documented everything and asked if I wanted to proceed with Grandma Rose's wishes. Before I could answer, his phone rang. The nursing home's number flashed on the screen, and somehow I knew before he even answered. Grandma Rose had waited until she knew I'd graduated, held on just long enough to know the test was complete. She passed away during the ceremony, probably around the time I was walking across the stage. The Johnsons drove me to the nursing home, where I said goodbye to the one family member who'd truly seen me. The staff told me she'd been watching the clock all morning, lucid and determined. Her last words were about me, about being proud, about choosing wisely. She'd left a letter with the nurse to give to me after the ceremony. Inside, her shaky handwriting delivered one final piece of wisdom. You passed the test, my dear one. Not theirs, but yours. You showed up for yourself even when no one else did. Now choose your real family and never look back. I sat in the nursing home parking lot, still in my cap and gown, holding that letter while the Johnsons waited patiently. My phone continued buzzing with beach photos and vacation updates from my biological family. They didn't know Grandma Rose was gone. They didn't know what they'd just lost. They didn't know that their absence at my graduation had just cost them more than they could imagine. But I knew. And for the first time in my life, I felt the strange freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to gain. My parents' return from Hawaii a week later was announced by an angry phone call at 6 in the morning. They'd just learned about Grandma Rose's death from a neighbor who'd seen the obituary in the local paper. My mother's voice was shrill with indignation as she demanded to know why I hadn't informed them immediately. Why hadn't I called them home from their vacation? How dare I make decisions about her mother without consulting them? The irony of her accusations while she'd been sipping cocktails on a beach as her mother died was apparently lost on her. I informed them calmly that the funeral had already taken place. Grandma Rose had pre-planned everything, wanting a small service with the people who'd actually visited her in life. The nursing home staff, her real friends from the book club, Mr. Chun, the Johnsons, and me. My mother's shriek of rage could probably be heard 3 apartments over. She kept repeating that she had rights as the daughter, that I had no authority to exclude them. I didn't bother explaining about the power of attorney. They'd find out soon enough. The confrontation at my apartment 2 hours later was exactly as dramatic as I'd expected. They arrived together, Cassandra trailing behind with puffy eyes that I suspected were more from the long flight than grief. My mother pushed past me into my small living room, already cataloging Grandma Rose's items she expected to claim. My father at least had the decency to look uncomfortable as he asked about the will. Cassandra immediately asked if Grandma had left her the vintage jewelry collection she'd always admired. I served them coffee in my mismatched mugs and watched them pretend to grieve. My mother dabbed at dry eyes while lamenting that she'd never gotten to say goodbye, conveniently forgetting the dozens of visits she'd canceled. My father spoke about Grandma Rose's generous spirit, which was rich considering how much money they'd taken from her. Cassandra just looked bored, probably calculating how long she'd have to pretend to be sad before she could ask about her inheritance. The public will reading was scheduled for the following morning at Mr. Chen's office. I watched my family arrive 15 minutes late, dressed in black, but checking their phones constantly. They perked up visibly when Mr. Chen began reading the preliminary will, the one leaving each of us $100,000. My mother actually smiled when she heard the amount, already whispering to my father about finally being able to help Cassandra's new business idea properly. They signed the necessary papers with barely concealed glee. As they celebrated in the parking lot, I overheard their plans. The money would go immediately to Cassandra's latest scheme, something involving essential oils and social media marketing. My mother was already on the phone with a real estate agent about putting a down payment on a vacation property that Cassandra could use for retreats. My father mentioned that I'd probably waste my portion on student loans, which was exactly what responsible people did with windfalls. They never once suggested pooling resources or helping each other. The money was already spent in their minds. 3 days later, the calls started. Cassandra needed a loan for startup costs, just until Grandma's money cleared. My mother hinted that family should support each other, that I'd always been selfish with money. My father sent a formal email outlining why investing in Cassandra's business would benefit the whole family. The amounts they requested were absurd, clearly assuming I'd received the same inheritance and would hand it over like I always had. I responded to each request with a simple no, offering no explanation. The real explosion came 2 weeks later when they discovered they'd already spent their inheritance before receiving it. Between the Hawaii trip on credit cards, deposits on Cassandra's business space, and the vacation property down payment, they'd blown through nearly the entire amount. The panic in my mother's voice when she called demanding I cover their shortfalls was almost satisfying. She accused me of hiding money, of taking advantage of my position as power of attorney. I simply reminded her that I'd received the same amount they had. A month after the first will reading, Mr. Chin called them back for what he termed an addendum discussion. I arrived early, sitting calmly as they filed in looking hopeful. Maybe there was more money, their faces said. Maybe they'd finally get what they really deserved. Mr. Chen's expression was professionally neutral as he explained that a second will had been discovered, properly executed and superseding the first in specific circumstances that had been met. The silence when he read the full inheritance amount was deafening. $2.5 million, properties, investments, all left to me with ironclad provisions that prevented any sharing with family, who had demonstrated a pattern of abandonment and exploitation. My mother's face went from white to red to purple as Mr. Chin methodically presented the evidence. Recordings of them taking money meant for my education. Documentation of missed events, broken promises, financial manipulation. The graduation absence was just the final proof in a file that painted a damning picture of their choices. Cassandra was the first to explode, screaming that I'd manipulated a dying woman. She accused me of poisoning Grandma against them, of planning this for years. The irony of her accusations while Mr. Chin played a recording of her trying to get power of attorney to move Grandma to a cheap facility was lost on her. She threatened to contest the will, to sue me for emotional distress, to expose me as a gold digger to everyone we knew. Her tantrum was so predictable I'd actually made bingo cards with Maya the night before. My parents tried a different approach, shifting from anger to manipulation. My mother cried about how hurt she was that I'd kept this secret, how family was supposed to trust each other. My father spoke about forgiveness and second chances, about how they'd always supported me in their own way. They rewrote history in real time, painting themselves as loving parents who'd made a few mistakes but didn't deserve to be cut off. The performance might have worked if I hadn't lived through the reality of their neglect. The final twist came when they tried to leave with their heads high, claiming moral superiority. That's when Mr. Chin delivered the last blow. The IRS had questions about unreported gifts from Grandma Rose over the years. All those loans they'd never repaid, all that money they'd claimed was for medical expenses, but went to Cassandra's shopping sprees. There was a paper trail, and tax evasion was a serious crime. They left his office in silence, finally understanding that their choices had consequences beyond just losing an inheritance. The weeks following the will reading were a masterclass in watching karma unfold in real time. I quietly set about executing Grandma Rose's final wishes while my family scrambled to salvage their crumbling financial house of cards. The first step was establishing the Rose Memorial Trust for Abandoned Children, funded with a significant portion of the inheritance. Grandma had been specific about wanting to help kids who, like me, had been overlooked by the people who should have loved them most. The scholarship would pay for college, but more importantly, it would pay for therapy, life coaching, and the kind of support I'd never had. Meanwhile, my phone became a battlefield of increasingly desperate messages. My mother sent long emails detailing their financial struggles, how unfair life had been to them, how Cassandra was suffering from anxiety about money. She seemed to have forgotten that I'd suffered from the same anxiety while working 3 jobs through college. My father tried logic, sending spreadsheets showing how investing in Cassandra's business would generate returns for everyone. The fact that he'd never made a spreadsheet for my education expenses wasn't lost on me. Cassandra took a different approach, launching a social media campaign painting me as the villain who'd stolen her grandmother's love and money. She posted old photos of family gatherings, carefully cropped to remove me or captioned to suggest I'd chosen not to attend. Her followers, mostly people trying to buy into her essential oil scheme, rallied around her with comments about greedy relatives and elder abuse. What she didn't know was that Mr. Chen was documenting every post for the potential defamation lawsuit. 3 months into their meltdown, I made a discovery that changed everything. The Johnsons, the family who'd shown up for my graduation when my own wouldn't, were facing a crisis of their own. Maya let it slip during coffee that her parents were considering selling their house. The medical bills from her sister's cancer treatment had finally caught up with them. They'd maxed out credit cards, taken second mortgages, done everything to save their daughter. Even though they'd lost that battle, the financial consequences remained. I did the math quickly. Their debt totaled just under $500,000. It was a crushing amount for a middle-class family, but represented only a fraction of what Grandma Rose had left me. More importantly, it was an investment in something real, people who understood the value of showing up. I met with Mr. Chen to set up an anonymous payment through the trust. The Johnsons would wake up one morning to find their mortgage paid off, their credit cards cleared, and a college fund established for their younger son. The timing was poetic. On the same day the Johnsons received notification that their debts had been mysteriously cleared, my parents received notice that the IRS was officially investigating their unreported income. The contrast was so perfect it felt like Grandma Rose was orchestrating things from beyond. My parents hired a lawyer they couldn't afford while the Johnsons cried with relief at their kitchen table, finally free from the crushing weight that grief had multiplied. My family's attempts to manipulate me grew more desperate as their situation worsened. They showed up at my office, making a scene in front of my colleagues about family loyalty and abandonment. Security had to escort them out when Cassandra started screaming about stolen inheritances. They tried to contact my employer, suggesting I'd engaged in elder abuse to gain financially. Fortunately, my law firm had dealt with vindictive family members before and shut down their attempts with legal cease and desist letters. The real entertainment came when Cassandra's business predictably failed. Without my parents' financial backing, her essential oil empire crumbled within weeks. Her social media filled with angry posts from people who'd bought into her downstream promises and found themselves with garages full of unsellable product. She tried to pivot to a new scheme involving cryptocurrency, but without startup capital, even her most gullible followers weren't buying in. The woman who'd spent her entire life being bankrolled was finally experiencing what I'd lived through for years. 6 months after the inheritance, I received a call from Maya that made every difficult decision worth it. The Johnsons wanted to meet with their anonymous benefactor. They'd hired a private investigator, not to seem ungrateful, but because they desperately wanted to thank whoever had saved them from bankruptcy. Mr. Johnson had written a letter to the unknown donor that Maya read to me over the phone. He talked about second chances, about being able to smile again, about his wife sleeping through the night for the first time in 3 years without anxiety medication. I agreed to meet them at their house, the same place that had become my refuge during family storms. When I arrived, their dining table was set with their best china, and Mrs. Johnson had cooked enough food for an army. They still didn't know I was their benefactor, just thought I was joining them for dinner. Maya had orchestrated everything perfectly, waiting until dessert to reveal the truth. The moment of recognition on their faces when they realized what I'd done was worth more than all the money in the world. Mr. Johnson broke down completely, this strong man who'd cheered for me at graduation sobbing into his hands. Mrs. Johnson held me so tight I could barely breathe, whispering thank you over and over. They tried to refuse, saying it was too much, that they couldn't accept it. But I explained about Grandma Rose, about choosing family, about how their kindness at my lowest moment had been worth more than money. I told them about the empty seats at graduation, and how they'd filled them without even being asked. The contrast between the two families became even starker as time went on. My parents, faced with IRS penalties and mounting legal bills, had to sell their house and move into a small apartment. Cassandra moved back in with them, 3 adults crammed into 2 bedrooms, fighting over money that no longer existed. Their social media went quiet, the beach photos and champagne toasts replaced by silence. Meanwhile, the Johnsons thrived, free from financial stress. They started a grief support group for parents who'd lost children, turning their pain into purpose. I learned through mutual acquaintances that my parents had started telling people I was dead to them. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were finally acknowledging what had always been true. They'd killed their relationship with me through 1,000 small abandonments, and the inheritance was just the death certificate. Cassandra occasionally tried to reconcile, but only when she needed something. Her messages always started with apologies and ended with requests for loans, following a pattern so predictable I could have written them myself. The sweetest revenge came in the quiet moments. Sitting at the Johnsons' dinner table for Sunday meals, being included in their family photos, getting texts from Mrs. Johnson just checking in. They gave me what money never could, the feeling of being chosen, valued, seen. Every holiday they insisted I join them was another reminder that family isn't about blood, but about who shows up. My graduation photos, prominently displayed on their mantle next to their daughters, proved that sometimes the best revenge is simply being loved by better people. Grandma Rose had been right about everything. The money hadn't been about punishment or even revenge. It had been about freedom. Freedom to stop chasing people who would always run away. Freedom to invest in relationships that gave back. Freedom to recognize that some people earn their abandonment through years of choices, while others earn their place through single acts of kindness. The inheritance had just been the tool to make those choices visible, to strip away the pretense and show everyone's true character. A year later, I established another scholarship specifically for law students whose families didn't support their education. The first recipient was a young woman whose parents had disowned her for choosing law over marriage. At the award ceremony, the Johnsons sat in the front row, cheering as loudly as they had at my graduation. My biological family wasn't invited. They'd made their choice in Hawaii, and I'd made mine in a nursing homeroom holding my grandmother's hand. Some choices, once made, can't be undone. The best you can do is choose better going forward. 1 year after that graduation day that changed everything, I stood in front of a small crowd at the grand opening of my law practice. The Johnsons occupied the entire front row, Mrs. Johnson clutching tissues she'd need before the day was over. The office was modest but mine, specializing in family law with a focus on helping adult children navigate toxic family dynamics. Every case I took reminded me why Grandma Rose's final gift had been about so much more than money. The practice thrived because I understood my clients in ways other lawyers couldn't. When they talked about being overlooked, about sacrificing everything only to be ignored, about watching siblings get handed what they'd worked for, I didn't just sympathize. I'd lived it. My conference room walls held no family photos from my childhood, but they were covered with cards from clients who'd finally found freedom from manipulation and guilt. Each thank you note represented someone who'd learned what I had, that you can't make people love you by giving them more opportunities to hurt you. My parents reached out once more, 8 months after the IRS had finished with them. They'd managed to avoid jail time but not financial ruin. The meeting request came through my assistant, formal and cold. I agreed to see them at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown where public behavior standards might keep things civil. They looked older, grayer, worn down by the consequences of their choices. For the first time in my life, they looked like they'd actually struggled. My mother opened with what sounded like a prepared speech about forgiveness and moving forward. She talked about mistakes and misunderstandings, about how families should stick together through hard times. She clearly rehearsed this, probably in front of the mirror, trying different expressions to see which looked most sincere. But when she got to the part about hoping I'd reconsider sharing Grandma's inheritance, her mask slipped. There it was, the real reason for this meeting. Not reconciliation, not love, just money. My father tried a different angle, suggesting we could all benefit from family therapy. He'd researched therapists who specialized in inheritance disputes, which told me everything about their priorities. When I asked if they'd come to my law firm opening next month, they exchanged glances that said everything. They hadn't even known about it. They still weren't interested in my life beyond what I could provide. The patterns Grandma Rose had identified decades ago remained unchanged, just with less polish now that desperation had worn away their facades. I left that meeting feeling nothing but peace. Not anger, not sadness, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd made the right choices. They were still my biological family, but biology had never been enough. The Johnsons were my chosen family, the ones who'd proven that love is an action, not an obligation. Every Sunday dinner at their house healing the wounds left by decades of neglect. Every proud introduction as their bonus daughter filling spaces I'd thought would stay empty forever. The letter from Grandma Rose that Mr. Chun gave me at my office opening was dated from before her death, but instructed to be delivered 1 year later. Her handwriting was shaky, but her message clear. She wrote about watching me bloom once freed from the shadow of false hope. She'd known the money would reveal truths that were always there, would simply make visible the choices people had been making all along. But mostly she wrote about love. How it multiplies when given freely. How it finds its way to those who deserve it. How blood means nothing compared to choice. She'd been right about everything. I'd lost my biological family at graduation, but I'd gained something worth more than millions. The Johnsons didn't share my DNA, but they shared my milestones, my struggles, my victories. They showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That's what real family does. They choose you again and again, in all the small moments that add up to a life. And in the end, that's worth more than any inheritance. The money just made it possible to see clearly who belonged in my life and who had chosen, long ago, to leave. Thank you all so much for listening to my story. I know many of you watching have experienced similar feelings of being overlooked or undervalued by family. My question for you is this. Have you ever had someone unexpected step up and become your chosen family when your biological family let you down? Please share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one and find so much strength in our shared stories. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life experiences about overcoming family betrayal and finding your true tribe. And please share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes the best revenge is simply choosing better people to love. Remember, you deserve to be someone's first choice, not their last resort. Until next time, choose wisely and love freely.